Uh, Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today at the 7th session of our conference, Why Still Education, Humanism, Posthumanism, and Anti-Humanism Educational Perspectives. In this session, we have 3 participants. Time schedule is 20 minutes for each presentation and 10 minutes for your questions, comments, suggestions. So our first speaker is Aleksandar Fatic, and his topic is Reinventing Education as a Therapy in the Age of Narcissism.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be here. And as you see, this is a fairly controversial topic, which I will try to address fairly briefly by relating the concept of education on the one hand and the concept of mental well-being or health on the other hand, and by trying to extrapolate on Jacques Lacan's idea, very, very crudely, idea of normalcy or mental well-being or mental health as optimal socialization, and the repercussions of that idea for the process of education and for the process of therapy, psychotherapy. So the idea is basically to explore, again very briefly, the relationship between education and psychotherapy, and whether education is in fact therapeutic, whether what we are facing today is the prospect of developing education which has the prerogatives and the qualities of a therapeutic process, and whether we can concur with the ancient Epicurean concept that no philosophy and by extension no education, no culture, no knowledge has any value if it's not therapeutic, if it does not cater to human pains, deprivation, suffering, stress, needs, etc., etc., etc. And this is something that very, very cumulatively, very summarily, we call the organic concept of education. Organic concept of education as therapeutic, as contributing to overall well-being, to contributing to the cohesiveness and the integrity of both the individual and the society, and a constructive interrelationship between the dynamics that characterize the psychological and psychic life of the individual on the one hand and the psychic life of the group or the society on the other hand. So let's start. Now, when we talk about public health today, especially after the corona crisis and all this, lockdowns and all the crises in terms of our freedoms and our social relationships that we have encountered over the past couple of years, we are used to thinking of public health in terms of epidemiology, in terms of diseases, infection, things like that. The controversial aspect of public health is that relating to mental health. Should we treat mental health, should we treat mental well-being and psychological well-being as an integral aspect of public health? And if public health indeed includes mental well-being, then what role education plays in not only in facilitating our capacities to deal with technological innovation, social challenges, issues of social structure, social relationships as they emerge with the progress of the society, but also with the quality of our life in that society. Because we face a situation where a lot of authors comment on this parallèle de béton, for example, on this disproportionality between the what we call progress, technological, the social, structural progress in terms of pace of our social interactions and the effectiveness of those interactions and the efficiency of the social processes on the one hand, and the level of satisfaction by members of the society on the other hand. In other words, we often face a situation where the demands placed on us by the society do not correspond to our ability to respond to those demands or to the satisfaction that arises from situations when we do satisfy the social demands. So the level of satisfaction seems to be decreasing in parts of the world, parallel with the increase in the overall social and economic, and if you want, political effectiveness and advancements in all kinds of social and political processes. So is education something that might act as a potential cure of that disproportionality, of that gap, of that wound in our relationship between the individual and the society or not? And in what way can it be a cure? Can it be a medicine rather than simply a repository of tools, as we often say, to deal with all kinds of technical and procedural choices and challenges that we face in everyday social life? According to Lacan, the idea of mental health is intrinsically linked with this concept of organic membership in a society, because according to him and the entire Lacanian psychoanalytic tradition, we cannot sensibly speak about mental health or mental well-being or normalcy in psychiatric terms in ways other than those that fundamentally boil down to successful socialization. Socialization in terms of accepting healthy social norms and being able to healthily and constructively contribute to the maintenance of a society, which in turn will facilitate the growth of a level of satisfaction that we consider productive for the continuation of that society. So it's sort of a mutual feedback. It is a process that goes through the feeding in of a contribution to the social structure and the feedback from the social structure to the satisfaction of the individual. This idea is probably most directly reflected in psychiatry in the works of the very founder of the modern psychotherapeutic clinic, the French psychiatrist Philippe Pinel, in 1800, who discussed the entire realm of mental health and psychiatric disorders as a realm of moral disorders. And he basically considered a lot of the psychiatric interventions as interventions which boil down to re-socialization. He called those interventions a moral re-education. So he basically saw the entire concept of mental health in highly normative terms, in the ethically normative terms, and this is this is fed into the Lacanian tradition of seeing normalcy and socialization, and obviously education is very akin to therapy, it's very close to therapy, where education contributes to socialization, but not just to any socialization. You can socialize yourself into being a patient in a psychiatric hospital. That's not the socialization that's desired, that's good for you. What Lacan talks about is a socialization which allows us to have proper normative structure, which allows us to derive satisfaction from those values which the society holds in high esteem. And to do that, we orient ourselves through what Lacan calls signifiers, where one of the key signifiers, and for Lacan, the main signifier, the key signifier, the leading signifier is what he calls a signifier, name of the Father with an obvious Christian meaning, which is a signifier that basically pertains to those influences in our life, to those authorities in our life, to those father-like French, bourgeois society of his time, father-like influences on our lives that play a key role in our socialization and in our moral development. Because as you know, in the French society of his time, it was a traditional role of the father in the family to socialize the child, where the role of the mother was to provide the warmth and unconditional love and support. So the role of the father was seen as that of the socializer, of the legislator, of the person who issues demands or sets criteria for the personal development of the child. And with social changes, this role of name of the father, the signifier, has shifted towards institutions, towards the society, towards the culture, towards the intellectual leaders, towards the elites. So the question really for Lacanians is whether our mental health is the same as our proper civic education, as our proper understanding of our role in a system, in a highly normatively loaded social structure in which we participate, and whether what is perceived as problematic in terms of our mental well-being is in fact all these situations which represent deviations from our ability to sort of align our sensibilities, our ability to derive satisfaction from fulfilling social expectations from those of most of the other members of our society. And this accounts for the cultural relativity of the concept of mental illness. Obviously, in various societies you will have various concepts of mental illness. People who are considered mentally ill in one society will be considered prophets in the other, and will be considered very special, highly valued members of the community in a third type of society. So normalcy is a social construct, but not just a social construct, it is also a structural part of the way in which we function. Now, the important element of all this is really what happens when normal socialization is disturbed, and what role education can play in terms of being therapy in such situations. So what happens when, if socialization is normalcy, to put it very bluntly and very crudely, then how does abnormality ensue from a poor socialization? And Lacan's response structurally is twofold. He says, if the role of the primary signifier name of the father, the socializing influence, the father, the institutions, the authorities, the culture, the science, whatever, if that influence is blocked for whatever reason, for example, imagine the French society of his time where a father goes away and abandons the family. The role of the father is still there. The place for the name of the father in the child's psyche is still there. It is preserved, but it is an empty place. It is blocked. The function is blocked. And when you generalize that, you get that with dysfunctional institutions. You get that when you live in a society where nothing works. There is a space, the mental space, for the name of the father, socializing influence of what the society and what the institution should be like, but in fact it's a blank space because there's no function, there's no effective function that those institutions fulfill in that mental space. And the result, according to Lacan, is neurosis. So where the name of the father is blocked, we develop neurosis. Neurosis is one type of mental dysfunction or difficulty in obtaining optimal mental well-being. However, when the name of the father, the signifier name of the father, is completely removed, when for some reason you have a cultural influence which says institutions don't matter, fathers don't matter, mothers matter, which is what we to a large extent have in large parts of the modern world, associated with all kinds of ideologies whose name I will not mention, but you can guess them. The result is psychosis, according to Lacan. So the result is the fact that the person can no longer normatively metabolize the reality, and he says the person becomes overwhelmed with the unbearable real, with a capital R. And as a result of that, the person ventures into the imaginary register of functioning, into the imaginary field which is broadly identifiable in diagnostics with psychosis. So according to Lacanians, modern Lacanians today, Paul Verhaag, for example, and many others, we have a society which in many aspects is a psychotic, in many aspects is a psychotic society with psychotic individuals. And our yearnings for security, for warmth, for attachment, all of these questions in psychology were theories of attachment, all kinds of outrageous theories of attachment which found entire psychotherapeutic schools, etc., etc. All of these are wanderings, all of these are quests to find an orientation, the name of the father structure within the social structure. This is why Lacanian psychoanalysis is called structuralism, because for him structure is the relationship. Structure is the same as a relationship. So seeking for identity, seeking for liberty, seeking for freedom without a presupposed relationship or set of relationships into which we are healthily socialized is a chimera, something that leads us into a psychosis. Now that's the first controversial element of the Lacanian interpretation of the modern situation in which we live. And the second is, what do we do in a situation where we develop psychosis, individual or collective psychosis, or we are threatened with the development of the psychosis because of the absence of the primary signifier name of the father? What do we do? How do we cure a psychosis? The answer is we don't. We can't cure psychosis. We can compensate for the removal of the vitally necessary primary signifier name of the father, authority, or socialization, by developing a symptom. We develop a symptom, we become ill, but we develop a symptom that is more acceptable than a complete personal disorganization. So our oddness, our strange ideologies, totalitarian ideologies, our strange conceptions of identity, society, our illusions that we participate in a progress which allows us to reinvent ourselves as no longer what we are, but as something completely different. All of these are symptoms which compensate the prospect of personal and social disorganization. And when you look at the actual correspondence between these psychoanalytic, very broad psychoanalytic categories and concepts on the one hand, and the actual situation in the world that we face now, you see, where you have issues of identity on the one hand, extremely escalated struggle between the opposing ideologies on the other hand, and the threat of nuclear annihilation, which the world leaders speak about today and yesterday. You see a threatening, I think, a threateningly convincing aspect of the Lacanian view of society. So what Lacan would probably say, and what Lacanians argue today about education, is really that we can no longer productively talk about sectoral education, specialist education, technological education, because all of these educations can be relegated to the realm of training. And if you look at the way public discourse goes about various sorts of processes, to call them that way, processes of acquisition of sectoral capacities, they are referred to as training. Let's train you in this and train you in that. I have a dog which is highly trained in many ways. I can train the dog. You can train the dog, but you can't educate the dog. You can only educate a person. And Lacan would say that we need therapy and education as largely synonymous, in the same way in which he believed that psychological normalcy, mental normalcy, mental health, mental well-being, and socialization are the same. I think in much the same way today, the Lacanians would interpret the current situation as saying that education is the same as therapy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mark Lochons from the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, and his topic is the anachronism of posthumanism, for a text against the discourse of posthumanism.
Thank you very much. I must apologize. My presentation will be very dense, so I will quickly summarize what my thesis will be. First, I will point out that posthumanist authors are fundamentally unclear about what they define themselves in relation to humanism. I will attempt to outline briefly, which is of course absurd a little bit, how man was viewed in the pre-modern and modern eras and what humanism really was. Thirdly, I will suggest that the alliance that is assumed between certain contemporary theories, neo-realist, speculative realist, new materialist, object-oriented and others, and posthumanist theories is far from self-evident. To put it simply, there is no posthumanist consensus at all. Finally, I will argue that posthumanism should be more concerned with its own conditions of production. I will try to outline a possible hypothesis placing posthumanism in the context of late capitalism, which may help us to understand its role. To show how much confusion there is about what humanism is, from which posthumanist theories are supposedly moving away, I took 5 works in turn, all of them representative of posthumanist theory: Rossi Braidotti's The Posthuman, David Rodin's Posthuman Life, Kerry Wolf, What is Posthumanism, and How we became posthuman by Anne Catherine Hayes, as well as a comprehensive publication from Eastern Europe, Hungary, written by Mark Horváth, Ádám Lovász, and Mário Z. Nemes, entitled Versions of Posthumanism. All of these books are extremely vague and confused about the nature of humanism, meaning that their authors seem to be unaware of what they are ultimately opposing or what they are trying to go beyond. The chaos becomes even more intolerable when we even compare these works. In my view, it is basically a straw man argument. Posthumanism constructs a meta-narrative about a supposed meta-narrative in order to slap it down or at least give it a stern rebuke. This narrative is overblown and superficial as a story, with very few details. If you look a little more closely, it fades into nothing, or at least there is little left of it. In the context of this lecture, I do not have the opportunity to illustrate this chaos in detail. This philological work will be done in my paper. Here I will have to content myself with a few brief remarks. First of all, it is not at all clear what the nature of humanism is. Discourse, institutional practice, philosophical doctrine, worldview, or all of these. Nor is it clear what the position is that all humanisms hold. Is it the vision of self-transparent subject, or that of the rational free man, or of a human-centered world? The confusion culminates in the historical identification of humanism. Some seem to argue that humanism is primarily attributable to the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, or modernity as such. Others would prefer to stretch the analysis considerably, that is, to extend it to antiquity and the Middle Ages. Ultimately, it is not clear whether Moses was more humanist or just Nazism, Homer too, or Bolshevism, or perhaps our father Abraham himself. Posthumanism wants at all costs to construct something called humanism, which it can then judge generously. It does its utmost to have at its disposal a sufficiently inflated explanation to explain, in certain cases, the whole Western history, the dynamics of modernity, or the totalitarian horrors of the 20th century. For example, Rosi Braidotti attributes the villainy of imperialisms to humanism. The problem with all this is that post-humanists simply falsely suggest that some kind of humanism was at work in the pre-modern era, but we must also take with reservations their claims about modern humanism. First of all, it should be noted that in pre-modern times, the humanity of man, that is, the existence of man in himself, I will use the masculine form for historical reasons, was very rarely questioned. Rather, man's position was defined in a hierarchy or per analogiam. Although man was often described as a kind of middle or middle-ranking being, mesotes, this did not imply that his role is central. Instead, it implied that man was of a dual nature, an amphibious being, last among the first, first among the last. For instance, because he is both material and spiritual. Or to put it another way, he is both animal and intellectual, bestiae intellectuales seu intellectum habentes, as Jean Ollier said. There was some uncertainty as to the precise understanding of this, for example, as to whether or not angels were superior to humans. The Jewish tradition, for example, basically considered angels superior. It was often noted that humans were disadvantaged creatures, neglected by Mother Nature, or that humans were negligible in the world. Man has very often been considered a microcosm, but the prefix micro is very important in this respect. He was considered small indeed. It was clear that man was not the best thing in the cosmos. As Aristotle wrote in the Nicomachean Ethics, there are many other realities more divine than man. Pre-modern writers often suggested that man has dignity at most insofar as he is given a share of the higher and intelligible world in proportion to his potential. One might think that at least the long-standing idea of the ascended erect man, Homo erectus, was a sign of man's superiority, but in fact it was thought to enable him to direct his gaze towards more superior beings. Plato even defined man, somewhat jokingly, as a being who could look upwards, anno atrein, but many authors followed him in conveying this idea as seriously as possible, from Philo and Isidore of Seville to Pierre Abelard. The scourging of the human condition as a wretched condition has been going on at least since Socrates, according to the tradition, addressed a sonorous tirade to the sophist Prodicus. Man, according to many, is not only a lazy creature, but a downright beastly one, and, according to some, because of his insatiable sexual appetites, others because he is omnivorous, panphagus, like the pig, and moreover, of all animals, he is the most prone to plunder and robbery. The Talmud contains a dialogue in which Shammai and Hillel argue about whether God did good when he created man. The answer is in the negative, and the best they can come up with is to make the best of the ready-made condition such as it is. As Remy Bragg writes about the pre-modern view on what is human in his The Wisdom of the World, I quote, "Man is of very little value compared with the rest of the world and is reduced to almost nothing when compared with the value of heavenly bodies. In all this, there is little that modern man could in a patronizing way call naive anthropomorphism. Man is just as cosmomorphic as, so to speak, the cosmos is anthropomorphic. Man is not alone, but is preceded by more sublime beings, the stars and the angels." The thesis of the alleged arrogant humanism of the pre-modern era is certainly a wrong one, and I regret that I have only been able to illustrate it in a minimalist way in the context of this short lecture. Okay. At this point in my presentation, since I cannot discuss modernity as a whole, that would be weird, I will focus specifically on the term humanism, including its relation to antiquity. Humanism is undoubtedly inseparable from being educated from what was called humanitas, which was a translation of the ancient Greek paideia. Since Cicero and Aulus Gellius, the term humaniora has been used to describe the study of contemporary authors who sought to become more human, humanior, and since the 15th century, readers of the classics have been called humaniste. These semantic links came together in a kind of amalgam, so that from 1921 onwards, Eduard Spranger, Werner Jäger, and others began to speak of a kind of third humanism, consisting above all of the study of antiquity, but also referring to the Italian Renaissance and Weimar Classicism, while remaining indifferent to or outright opposed to Christianity. Even before that, humanism was understood as essentially the study of antiquity by educationalists such as Friedrich Immanuel Niethammer and historians such as Karl Heinrich Wilhelm Hagen and Georg Voigt and Jakob Burckhardt. We can see the logic by which they began to project a vision of humanism onto antiquity, but not in the same sense as contemporary posthumanists who analyze humanism. The arrogant anthropocentrism and the intention to eliminate any alterity, any other, that posthumanism attributes to humanism are hardly to be found here. In addition to the study of antiquity, humanism has meant at least one other thing, a move away from Christianity, whether within or independent of antiquity studies. Thus, for example, since Georg Holyoake's initiative in 1846, humanism has appeared in the company of secularism, but also since 1869, thanks to Thomas Huxley, in the company of agnosticism with atheistic tendencies. The Humanist Manifesto of 1933, signed by many in Chicago, was part of this general trend. Nevertheless, the discourse of men was anything but unanimous. We have not even mentioned the explicit counter-discourses. For instance, in 1864, George Perkins Marsh published Man and Nature, which rejected the idea of man as ruler of the earth. His work gave rise to an entire movement. Marx is also known, for example, to have embedded humanism in the framework of naturalism in his economic philosophical manuscripts. The supposed supremacy of man, anthropocentrism, or supposed dominant humanism was rejected by a series of thinkers. Perhaps the most poignant examples come from Russian sources. In 1919, Alexander Blok spoke out against humanism in the name of anti-humanism, by which he meant mainly the individualism of the Italian Renaissance and Weimar Classicism, while Nikolai Berdyaev, in praising the new Middle Ages, spoke of the end of humanism and the Renaissance, which would essentially end the era of atheism. Later, Ezra Pound was perhaps even clearer when he said that humanism was an old bitch gun in the teeth. The above overview is, of course, inexcusably sketchy, but it is nonetheless enough to show that the voices about men in modernity are highly polyphonic. Humanism has meant, first and foremost, an adherence to antiquity or a distancing from religion, cutting ties with transcendence, and those who have opposed it, whether aesthetically or religiously, have attacked it for these reasons. In humanism, however, we rarely see the arrogance and violence, horrible dictu, genocide attributed to it. The humanist societies of the 19th and 20th centuries were more characterized by philanthropy and the practice of solidarity. In my third intervention, I would like to point out that contemporary theories, neorealist, speculative realist, neo-materialist, object-oriented, and others, are not as clear an ally of post-humanist theory as post-humanists themselves would like to suggest sometimes. I will give you some representative examples. Take, for instance, the speculative materialism of Quentin Meillassoux, which of course tries to go beyond finitude and offer something new in relation to Kant, who is responsible for the anthropological turn. In fact, however, it is clear that Meillassoux sees the emergence of man and of consciousness as a kind of rupture in the history of reality, even as a kind of ex nihilo miracle. Or there is Marcus Gabriel, who is committed to an ontological pluralism of fields of meaning, a message that culminates in Gabriel's neo-existentialism. In the finale of I Am Not a Brain, Gabriel revisits Heidegger's and Foucault's anti-humanism or post-humanism in a polemical spirit and makes his position clear in the very title of the chapter, Man is not a face in the sand. Maurizio Ferraris, who advocates an ontology of the layers of reality, can also be cited as an example. Of particular importance to him is to outline how social objects work, namely their documentary nature. He devotes a whole social ontology to them. In doing so, he does not hesitate to consider man as a special being. He sometimes considers inscription not only as a condition of possibility for sociality in general, but also as a basic anthropological sign. That is, he defines man as an animal living in the midst of documents and capable of making and signing promises through the mediation of documents. Finally, we may mention the philosophy of Jocelyn Benoit, whose contextualism is very important, namely that there is no view from nowhere, but that there are always concrete perspectives from which we cannot depart. In opposition to grammatical blindness, he emphasizes the relative autonomy of language or the social determination of our experience, an objectified institutionalized reality. We hardly see any posthumanism in his theory. To sum it up, it is wrong to suggest that posthumanists can, without further ado, find allies in these contemporary theories. Rather, it is the case that they resist the posthumanist conclusions. Neither do they accept what is suggested about humanism in general, nor are they willing to deny the existence or specificity or normative implications of the conditio humana. There is simply no such a thing as a posthumanist consensus, even in contemporary continental or post-continental theories. Even radical critiques of subjectivity do not imply acceptance of the posthumanist position. For the sake of humor, I end by quoting the complexivist Deleuzian Manuel de Landa, who declared that I have always thought the word posthuman is very silly and never used it. In conclusion, we must be very careful when we take for granted the alliance of posthumanism with other contemporary theories. At the end of my presentation, I will say a few words about the archaeology of posthumanism in the history of ideas. I believe that we need to situate posthumanism as a theory in the ideological history of capitalism, and Robert Kurtz's Subject Without Domination can help us in this. Kurtz analyzes the way in which capitalism has become more and more abstract throughout its history, and the way in which case-like classes based on personal identity have become less and less relevant. A theoretical symptom of this has been the proliferation of theories that have sought to capture impersonal forms of power. In Kurtz's reading, this was already the case with the Weberian and Michelsian analysis of bureaucratism and Trotsky's critique of bureaucracy. This trend continued with structuralism, in relation to which Kurtz writes, The finally attained concept of subjectless domination, being identical with the death of the subject in general, also destroys the hypothetical adversary of domination, the emancipatory counter-subject. Needless to say, Althusserian theoretical anti-humanism fits in here, but so does systems sociology, such as Parsons or Luhmann, where man is transformed into the mere environment of the social system as a system of systems. But it also includes, of course, Michel Foucault, whose microphysics of power is a determined expression of his distance from the subject and his central position, culminating in his critique of existentialism and humanism. The theory, which has become purely structural and impersonal, in line with the development of the society, expels man and humanism from its vocabulary or uses it in a purely negative sense. I think there is every reason to place posthumanism within this interpretative framework. There is also the fact that the posthumanists themselves, Braidotti and others, assume continuity and kinship with the theoretical anti-humanists of the past, although sometimes in a critical way. All in all, posthumanism is above all a characteristic symptom of a mature late capitalism that has become utterly abstract. This framing is certainly not enough to grasp posthumanism in all its complexity, but it can serve as a starting point for interpretation. I will conclude with a question. When posthumanist theory, which emerges in the midst of social processes of abstraction, itself struggles with a grandiose and vague abstraction, that of humanism, does it correctly identify the forces actually at work in society? What is certain is that posthumanism must be aware of its own conditions of production. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. And the last speaker is Natasha Reynolds, and with the topic Keeping Children Safe, a Speculative Posthuman Inquiry. Natasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I'm not sure how to follow that now, the posthuman inquiry. Today's really special for me for a couple of reasons. One of the things is this is my very first in-person academic conference. Sorry. So this is my very first ever academic in-person conference. It's also the very first time that I've been able to call myself doctor, which is why it's up on the slide, because I was quite excited about that. And also, it happens to be in my mum's home country. My mum is from Serbia, and I am in awe of all of you who have sat here and talked in your second and third languages, and I can barely order a cup of coffee in Serbian. I apologise, I'm so sorry. So I'm not an accidental academic, but I am a latecomer to academia. I've very much been in the world of practicing. I've worked with teenagers, basically, young people for over 30 years, and particularly the young people that fall outside the boundaries of typical schooling, typical family lives, those sort of things. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a sort of speculative inquiry about how we might better serve the young people in order to get better outcomes for them. And I'm going to draw on a little bit of my PhD. Oh, let me see it that way. Ah. No, don't work. Do I get longer then? I'll carry on talking and then we can move it on, it's fine. So what I'm going to be talking about today is very much grounded in not only my PhD that I've just finished, but also that background in working with children and young people. Thank you. talking a little bit about the English safeguarding system, because I realise that a lot of people won't really know what that is. And then drawing some potential learning. So learning from my PhD and how we might apply that, not only really in education in the formal sense, but really thinking about informal learning and how we might draw that to learn about how a child experiences their home, and to think about how we protect them from harm. So, as I said, when I was thinking about doing my research and my PhD, my background is in youth work, which is very much a relationship-based approach to working with children and young people. And I, over the years, I became really fascinated with how we do relationships between professionals and young people, particularly. I mean, I'll talk about children and young people, but it's really young people that's my background. And actually lots of professionals would talk about how difficult they find it to work with teenagers, to work with young people, and that there are lots of problems. So even though we think doing relationships is quite easy, actually there are a lot of problems with it, and there's a lot of evidence to show that when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong. And so there's a need to think how we can keep people safe. So when I was looking around, I was thinking about what inhibits those relationship-making practices, and what promotes them, what's helpful. And when I first started the PhD, I was absolutely amazed at how much research was out there that says this is the way that you do relationships. You need to have trust, you need to have support, you need to have concern and understanding. We know what a good relationship feels like. We can probably say what a good relationship looks like. But actually, when you get into it, you couldn't really see what was happening. So there's lots of things about this is what it should be, but you couldn't see what it was like to do it. And so I was really interested in thinking about that. And it was when I was introduced to posthumanism and thinking about events and materiality, intensities and effect, that really, it seemed intuitive to me. It was really, it sort of really hit home about actually this is what I'm looking for. This is what I need to think about relationships. And so, I turned to thinking about it not just as human endeavours, so even though we're talking about human-to-human relationships, but thinking about that within the context of the world, being within the world. And so my overarching research question was looking at how relationships are done in the context of a non-formal community-based programme like NCS, and I'll explain NCS in a moment. But had sub-questions which were about what was implicated in those relationships and what learning emerges from this. So NCS, the National Citizen Service, I won't go into too much detail about it, but I really was trying an attempt into empirical posthumanism, actually doing posthumanism, thinking about what that's like. And so because I wanted to see relationships being done, it was an ethnographic study. And NCS as a programme, the National Citizen Service, is a government scheme aimed at 16-year-olds, which is about volunteering. It's about citizenship. It's been rightly critiqued for being encouraging and mandating a citizenship that's very much within that neoliberal framework, and being critiqued for not actually allowing children's voice to develop. You know, there's nothing about dissent or activism. It's about a very one-sided concept of citizenship. However, that's a whole other lecture, really, a whole other presentation. What I was really keen was the fact that what NCS offered at the time was something really unique, and that was seeing relationships being done right from the start. So when people go on the course, start the course, neither the adults or the young people know each other. So these are 16-year-olds, and they go away for that first week, and they're a couple of friends, but they don't know each other. So in effect, you're seeing relationships right from the start. The other thing about NCS is the fact that each week is very different. And so the first 2 weeks you go away and you stay in different places. They have different activities they do. And then the third and fourth week are back in their communities, and the final week being a volunteer week. So actually, when you're thinking about context, when you're thinking about environment, when you're thinking about materiality, it offered very different things for the whole 4 weeks. So on return from my physical field work, and really mindful of the sense that I'm always in the middle of the research, and even as a practitioner, I never came at this from the beginning. This was not brand new to me, and I've been mindful of that throughout. I really started to think about what does empirical analysis look like within posthumanism, and sort of thinking about that fluid temporal and spatial encounters and how I deal with those. So Carol, your name is in my presentation. So my guidance did come from people like Carol, Maggie McClure, Elizabeth Adams St Pierre, thinking about what it really looked like to do sort of analysis within that post-human approach. And so I use concepts such as wonder, the movement of things, thinking with theory, and diffractive readings in analysing the data. And I played with ideas of transgressive data. So someone mentioned this morning about dreams. I've played a lot around with memories and my senses, my responses to things, and thinking about how I would use things that couldn't necessarily be nicely categorised. One of the words that sort of came up a lot was glow. Maggie McClure talks about glow as the entanglement of research and data that resonates and causes curiosity. So I was really thinking about how I could use all of those things in my analysis. So my empirical chapters explored both events and things, and my first chapter centred on an argument over a swivel chair, you know, the really nice big desk chairs that there was an argument between an adult and one of the staff members and a young person. And I won't go into all of this in detail, but one of the things about that moment, that event, was that it was about considering the messiness and complexity of how trajectories coalesce in that moment and how we sort of get entangled in that moment and things become agentic. I'm sure we've all had arguments with partners over who takes the rubbish out or puts, you know, who takes the dishwasher, cleans the dishwasher up, those sort of things. So it was a sort of look at those sort of things as they came together and trying to think about how you could represent that, or not represent that, resonate that really. My next chapter focused on noise and its entanglement. And noise, not as we typically think a bit about it, but noise is something that is done within and between bodies and how that impacts those relationships through that noise. Its capacity to be effective in building those relationships. So considering that embodied nature of learning with each other. And I resisted this for quite a long time, but my third chapter ended up being about mobile phones. I tried not to because it seemed a bit of a cliche, if I'm honest. But actually, I was really drawn to it based on my experiences and then thinking about the mobile phone across the different weeks. So thinking about what it did in those different weeks, where did it go, who used it, how was it used, how or what gets transformed in that use, and what's its relationship with the environment it encounters. So the conclusions I came to recognise that relationships aren't just human to human, they are co-constituted with and within the world. Connections that are within entanglements that are not only physical, psychological, emotional, spatial and temporal, and that learning is a collective endeavour. So when you think about sort of the binaries that we talked about a lot over the last few weeks, and you think about something like the mobile phone, actually it's not good or bad. It just depends how we're using it, where we're using it, who's using it, and how it's interacting. It's more or less agentic according to the environment. So, you know, if there's no Wi-Fi, no signal, actually a mobile phone is pretty useless to most young people. But really thinking about where it was constructive, where it's destructive, and it wasn't always the same for everybody. So before I sort of move on to making those connections, what is safeguarding? So safeguarding is the child protection system within England. It's about how we keep children safe. It's a complex legislated system. And when I talk about the English safeguarding children system, it does imply that there is consistency. There isn't. There is a strategic framework. There are legislation about some of the key things that have to be in place. But in effect, the operational delivery and the different models vary according to where you are. but it all has to sort of align to what's called the Working Together 2018 guidance. And it follows the guidance follows two principles which underlie all the work around safeguarding. And safeguarding is not just social workers, it's not just teachers, it's anybody who works with children or who is remotely connected to children. So things like probation officers have to be mindful of it, even though they don't work with children. So the two principles are, excuse me, children's voices and experiences should be at the heart of the work, and that it's everyone's responsibility to follow through on this. So there is no getting around the fact, although it's not a legal requirement to report your concerns, you should be reporting your concerns if you are concerned for the welfare of a child. I'll just pause there just to say a couple of things. First thing, I'm not really going to talk about any incidents about working with young people in any detail, but I get that I am talking about harm, so there might be something that is upsetting for some people, so just look after yourselves. The second thing is, when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about some of the issues, but actually in the world, in the safeguarding system, lots of children, thousands of children are adequately protected, and there are lots of people doing really good work. So this is not a dig at the people who are working in it. This is just the fault of the systems. In many ways, the system's a binary system. It's a gatekeeping system. There's a yes or no to it. So there's a threshold on managing risks, and various points of that. At various points in that, people either move up or down the system, and they will have a yes or no according to the service that they can receive. So what that means is that people gatekeep. It also means that actually children aren't necessarily getting the right service that they need at the right time that they need it, and in a timely and in proportionate way. Interventions tend to be reactive rather than proactive, and it tends to be on a deficit basis rather than a strengths basis. And the discourse around all of this is very functional. It's about assessments, it's about interventions and programs. However, in recent years, there has been a move to this bottom bit, which is an ambition to be professionally curious, relationship-based, and trauma-informed, which are great little buzzwords that get used. The idea is that we move to a more holistic approach. However, with anything with buzzwords, they've proved really difficult to implement, because actually we don't know what that really is, and that comes up time and time again in the learning. And so actually what I want to talk a little bit today is how we might identify practices that can help with that. So as you can imagine, with any system, there are lots of faults within that system. Some of that is governmental. Things like austerity meant that lots of money got taken out of the system, and that young people weren't getting early help, so all our youth services were decimated. And that actually when people, that coincided with an increased awareness because of some child deaths, some high profile child deaths, and so people are much more aware of the child protection system. So kids get referred, but they get referred at a later date with a much higher degree of need, which is much more expensive then to work with. And we know this, and one of the things that happens within the system is something called serious case reviews and safeguarding practice reviews. So I'll refer to SBRs because that's what they are now. They're a statutory requirement to investigate critical incidents when a child dies or is seriously harmed from abuse, basically, whether that's within the family or outside the family. Another criteria for it is professionals have to have been involved, and that there needs to be potential learning from that. Now, all of the individual serious case reviews and SBRs get reviewed every 3 years as part of a triennial review where we get the learning from them. And actually, over the last 25, 30 years, the learning hasn't changed. We're still making the same mistakes. So not long-standing neglect, for instance, we're not very good at recognising neglect. Or when we do recognise neglect, we normalise it. We're also not very good at thinking about how we deal with neglect and how we help families with neglect. And this is all compounded by issues of poverty as part of that. The triennial reviews also highlight issues in building effective relationships between professionals and children, and this is where I sort of came in with my first thoughts. And there are lots of issues with communication, so lack of information sharing at the right time, not talking to each other, and then a lack of resources that aren't shared. Pivotal to all of this is that the child isn't often centred. We don't know the lived experience of the child, and actually that's one of the principles. We're supposed to know what it's like to be that child. We're supposed to have that knowledge of that child. And actually, even when their experiences are sought and we try to understand them, we're not very good at then doing something with it. And so it kind of gets put to the side. So, for me, thinking about making the links between post-human approaches, thinking about my research, thinking about events, materiality and effect, I started to think about actually, I finished my thesis by thinking about what would deeper engagement with post-humanism mean for the practice of education, but actually I think it has just as much resonance with safeguarding across the board. So if we start with the example that learning is a collective endeavour, rather than just an individual task, it means that we need to start thinking about how we understand that, how we attune to the moment, and how we start to sort of think about valuing different knowledges as part of that professional relationship. Thinking about disrupting that distinction between teacher and student and social worker and child, for instance, so that we can really value what that child, the children, the young people are bringing, and really starting to think about how we can help that. Now that's actually quite a difficult thing to do. How do we help the practitioner to sort of learn that? Because if we're asking professionals to be to have professional curiosity, to attune to the moment, that requires a process of defamiliarisation. And that's really hard to do, particularly if you've been doing the same job for many years, you've got habits that you do, and also you've got all of this legislative and institutional demands on you. And so one of the things that I think might help in getting them to think about the micro moments that are happening, to be able to become attuned to those micro moments so that we can start to notice some of the differences, because it's in the differences, it's not necessarily what children tell us, it's what children do that help us understand safeguarding and understand what's going on for them. So actually one of the things we might want to do is rethink things like supervision. Rather than having reflective practice, thinking about diffractive practice and thinking about what that might look like in terms of understanding that experience. Also recognising that trauma-informed is about actually we bring our histories with us. We bring our history to the moment, but actually what we tend to do is look at that through the lens of representations. So, example, attachment theory helps us explore the cognitive representations of relationships. But actually, if we start to think about how our body is within that, and to start to think about how our body both holds histories, but holds potentials as well, and in the moment can tell us things, the way that we react to things, the way that we are in that moment can tell me about you. And actually, how do I become more attuned to that and think about that? So thinking about how our bodies aren't just influenced by the history, but actually we influence each other in the here and now. So remembering that they have the capacity to be both effective and effective in any sort of iteration. Similarly, drawing on the work of Kay and others and thinking about what does it mean to value the non-human as fellow pedagogues, I think this is really important when we start to think about children and neglect. So, for instance, Carol's following of dirt yesterday. If we think about a child who turns up to school with dirty clothes, is dirty, what do we do with that? All we do is think about, well, they're dirty, perhaps we need to say something to mum most of the time. Actually, what would it be to follow that dirt and to really think about what that dirt is like for that child, how they experience that dirt every day, and what that must be like for them? Because if we can start to think about those things, we might be able to understand and then help them shape the future that they want and they need to keep them safe. Similarly, when you think about a dirty nappy on a toddler, you know, we just say that nappy's been on there too long, and we record it as the child's been in a nappy too long and they need to change it. But what is that dirty nappy doing? You think about a heavy, dirty nappy dragging a child, a toddler, who can crawl, how that impedes their crawling and therefore impedes their development because they're not touching, they're not feeling, they're not doing all the things that we would expect a toddler, a baby to do. So moving away from those sort of materiality and thinking about how relationships are, I love this word, symbiotic, the Haraway word, I love it, an iterative process of ongoing learning. Each interaction can change relationships ever so slightly, whether for the positive or negative, and it is in that collective potential that we can make a difference to children and young people. So I think about one of these things in relationships. Instead of, I get asked loads of times, lots and lots of times, how do we avoid conflict? How do we manage bad behaviour? Instead of going in thinking of that, why don't we go in thinking about actually what would harmony look like? Some Indigenous tribes think about that. What's the practice of being together look like? How do we do that in a better way? And I think if we start to think a little bit creatively around some of these things, we might start to think very differently about the experience of the child. So one of the things that gets done is an activity called Wishes and Feelings. It's very much a paper exercise. They might draw, they might colour, but it's about the wishes and feelings of the child. Well, that's about representation, and children have also said to us that actually when they go to some of the multi-agency workers with all of these professionals, what's being represented isn't how they feel. So why don't we play about with our wishes and feelings? Why don't we do some TikToks? Why don't we do some films? Why don't we do a piece of music? Anything that gets people to resonate with their experience rather than just represent their experience. So these are just some of the ideas that I've had. I think in terms of relationships and learning in whatever environment, it's about how we might change practice one habit at a time. I get that this is really difficult to do. I come from a doing background, and I really want to make sure that we help practitioners do more. I think posthumanism isn't going to solve structural inequalities or institutional pressures just like that, but I do think it offers us a bridge between the individual, the world, thinking about some of those small changes that might go some way to making the big changes possible. Relationships are key to this, not just the human to human, but our connections with the world around us. Thank you.
Is there any questions, comments? Okay.
Hi, thanks everybody. Okay, I've got a question for Natasha, and it's a question about theory and method. So not so much about the substance, but perhaps about the substance. I wanted you to talk a little bit about the relationship between posthumanism and post-qualitative. And the reason I'm asking that is because I'm just wondering if everybody in the room is familiar with post-qualitative. But also, I find the phrase, the term, post-qualitative a little bit problematic. And I just wondered what you thought about it.
Yeah, it was really difficult, actually, because, like I said, one of the things that I wanted to do was think about events, think about feelings, think about other than just capturing words and language. And so I was, in some ways, the methodology looked very similar to what anybody would do. I went to a site, I took pictures, I took audio recordings, I spoke to people, and I was there. I recorded in little books, I recorded little notes, very, very similar. I think for me, when I came back, and I was thinking, because I didn't want to fall into that, the themes coming out of it, I didn't want to reduce it to anything. I wanted to capture that complexity. Thinking about other ways to analyse, for me, helped bring out that complexity. So things that nagged at me, things that I kept coming back to. So, for instance, with that chair incident, I've actually got very little data around it. And that's partly because of physical data around it. That's partly because one of the things that I was really conscious of was being ethical and accountable. And I didn't just want to record bad things happening, but I kept thinking about it. And then it came up when I was interviewing one of the staff members at the end of the week, the one that was involved with it, and it came up with her. And so for me then it was about using that sense of wonder to then look at all I had, my memories, to think about what might have been happening in the moment. So I understand why post-qualitative is problematic, because a lot of what you do looks very similar to the qualitative side of it. I think for me, it was much more about the analysis rather than the doing of the methodology.
Thank you.
Natasha, just you mentioned about, I suppose, diffractive supervision as opposed to reflective supervision, and I'm just thinking because reflection is such a key part of reflective practice in that. And I got a sense that you were talking about maybe let's move towards diffractive supervision. I wonder, could you just say a little bit about that? Because it's so embedded in a lot of the programs where you're working with vulnerable people. So this is something I was interested in. Maybe just say a little bit more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I knew someone's going to ask me, and I'm going to go, I don't know. I'm very early in the stages of thinking. I think the trouble with reflective supervision is that it doesn't ever really explore what's going on unless you've got a very, very good supervisor. Like Barad says, it's about just reflecting and copying what somebody said. Thinking about diffractive supervision, for me, would be really starting to play with the different perspectives that are coming in and really getting people to think about those different perspectives, and maybe being a bit more creative in how we do that. So not just having that sit-down conversation, but maybe playing with people to get them to move around to think, what does that feel like? So that we can start to read different perspectives and then think about what might be going on. But actually, I'm really interested in sort of looking at that a bit further and thinking about that in more detail, and possibly is one of the things that I'm going to sort of take forward as I go forward.
I think your examples that you gave, they were really strong examples as well, you know, but you get a sense of completely changing the perspective when you are looking at supervision through that lens. So it's really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to build up on this about diffractive supervision. Actually, I'm not familiar with the term, but I am working with some vulnerable groups, and what we are always struggling with our own vulnerability as well, and it's affecting all of us who are working with them in so many levels. And I think this care should go that way also. So I just am curious, how do you deal with the simply burnout, or and how the supervision can help? Not your personally, but in this kind of approach.
Yeah, I think because the danger is with a lot of supervision is that it becomes very functional. People go in, they have set things to talk about, and there's not much room to explore things. It's supposed to be about exploring things, but because of time pressures, etc., it's not. And actually, that requires accountability, I think, in terms of saying, right, we're going to put this aside, and we're really going to explore this issue. We're not just going to move on to the next thing. I'm not going to ask you about your targets, because that comes into supervision a lot of the time. I'm not going to ask you about, if you ask how someone's feeling, it'll be how are you feeling? Well, I'm a bit tired. Yeah, okay, right, what's next? And so it's moving, trying to get the time into a schedule so that people can have proper time to explore things.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I actually have one question for Mark and one for Alexander, if I'm allowed to ask two questions. So, Mark, very interesting research, very interesting, I I would say, lecture and really deep dive into the history of the concept. But my question is, probably you have, while doing this research, probably you have run into something in different cultures, in different languages, and maybe other than European understanding of humanism, post-humanism, like, I don't know, Ubuntu concept from African philosophy.
Oh, no, I didn't deal with that. And yes, you are right that my view is quite Western-centric, but I think the same goes for theoretical anti-humanists and post-humanists themselves. If we look at their books, we simply don't see references to non-Western, significant non-Western sources. That's how I would methodologically explain what I did. But you are right that that we should enlarge our perspective and critically we should have critical researches on what is being human in other cultures, Chinese, Indian, and so on. So yes, I agree. Fundamentally, yes, of course.
Thank you. And am I allowed one more question to Alexander? Again, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to hear this wonderful and very deep talk about a very important, I would say, very important topic. I'm not a psychologist, not a psychiatrist in any way, but I understand that, well, the issue is very complex. My question is related to the issue of schizophrenia, which is a very well researched field, rather well researched field, and a particular topic of particular concept of strange objects.
Oh,
yeah, strange objects in psychiatry. It's the objects that appear and that are reported by those who have hallucinations, basically. While listening to your presentation, I thought that maybe that would be an interesting inquiry when we represent the social constructs which are imposed while the process of learning, while educating a person, especially in the childhood, and it's a kind of strange objects to the person who is unfamiliar with this system. For example, when we are inside a totalitarian society and there are particular patterns, particular non-existing objects that are imposed on every person in this society. It looks a little bit like strange objects distributed massively through the system of education.
distributed?
Distributed through the system of education, yeah. For example.
Yeah, thank you very much. This requires, I'm now getting enthusiastic after this question. Yeah. When you look at the psychotherapeutic context of normalcy and socialization, then you know the two complementary questions are: what is normal? What is the ideal of mental and social health on the one hand, and what is the catastrophic outcome on the other hand? So in psychiatry, the ideal of health is just an ideal. It's the approximation of a society's vision of ideal citizenship, ideal fellowship, ideal morality, ideal resilience, ideal whatever, maturity, etc. So it's fuzzy, it's fluid. But the catastrophic, many people make a mistake, you know, the catastrophic outcome in psychiatry is not death. They often say, you know, there's only one way in which death occurs in a way relevant to psychiatry, and that's suicide. But suicide is not the catastrophic outcome of psychiatry. If you look at the way psychoanalysts understand mental health, they understand mental health as a cohesion of the organization of the personality. And the opposite to that is a complete disorganization, inability to act. So Lacanian psychoanalysts often pointed out that the catastrophic outcome is not a suicide, it is catatonia. The catastrophic outcome is a situation where you are so disorganized that you can no longer control your body, that you are not a person anymore, not an acting person, not a subject in any intersubjective structural relationship. In order to commit a suicide, you do have to have a degree of personality organization to be able to act. So when you look at it structurally, in a structuralist way, then psychosis is everywhere. It's distributed throughout the education system in the form of symptomatization, compensations for the absence of that structural socializing authority. And yeah, strange objects occur in all kinds of ways, but how do I see strange objects? How do I start to see strange objects? You know, there's a paper by Anders Lindseth, a Norwegian psychotherapist and philosopher, and he says, psychosis is a situation where you imagine that you're traveling along a road. This is the road of your life. And you encounter all kinds of experiences which you're able to metabolize emotionally and cognitively in whatever way, existentially. And then suddenly there's a fallen tree across the road, and you can't, it's a huge tree, you can't climb across the tree, you can't continue on your way. You have to get off the road into the bush, and you have to go around the tree. And while you are going around the tree, you get lost in the bush. You know, the day is out, you are scared, you start screaming, you start seeing strange objects, you start being anxious, they give you medicines, they give you medication, the fear subsides, but nothing changes. How do you get back on the road? You only get back on the road if there's another person who is willing to get off the road and go look for you. The problem in that process is that that person loses sight of the road as well and can only orient themselves by your screams. And as long as you scream, they will stand a chance of finding you and bringing you back on your road. That's the process of organic community building. That's the process of education, and that's the process of therapy. And strange objects are just that. They're just the phenomena arising from our having wandered off our normal social road. But we need to have someone to care for us sufficiently and to understand what the road is and where the road goes to be able to help us. And these post and neo-postmodernist times and the neo-liberal societies and all these prefixes, we have only substitutes for confusion, for normative confusion. So we have increasing numbers of people who are somewhere in the bush crying, and an increasing number of structures which try to cater for them by various nosologies, various classifications, various stigmas, various diagnoses, instead of understanding the organic nature of therapy and education as a social process, of enhancing well-being by striving to streamline the social normative structure of socialization. I hope that's the answer to your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, you already answered my question without me even posting it. Thank you.
There is no questions. We can finish here. So, please again.